Cereal has a very long history in the United States. Going all the way back, the Native Americans found a way to grind up corn to make a breakfast product that we today would know as grits. But modern cereal dates back to 1854 when a German immigrant named Ferdinand Schumacher was in the back room of his store in Akron, Ohio, using a hand oat grinder to produce his own cereal. And in 1887, Schumacher adopted the mascot of a Quaker to present this cereal. This was a big deal. They needed a trusted face behind it because most people thought of oats as being horse food. And with that, the American cereal revolution began. Now, right around the same time, there was another man named James Jackson, and he was in New York making a product he called granola. Now, this was not the same as granola, but this was one of the very earliest breakfast cereals. Now, they promised miracles with their product. This 100-year-old cereal ad promises that it's going to give you rosy cheeks and sparkling eyes. Cut to the 1920s and cereal starts to become more and more popular with advertising in newspaper, print, and on billboards. Radio was king at this time. In 1920, KDKA in Pittsburgh became the first station to regularly offer radio broadcasts. And it was Wheaties, released in 1924, that had the very first radio jingle.
Try Wheaties, for wheat is the best food of man.
Wheaties was made by Washburn Crosby Incorporated, which later became General Mills, and it was made by accident. A bunch of wheat bran had been spilled on a hot stove, and next thing you know, you had a delicious toasted cereal. Now today we think of Wheaties and associate it with sports. Well, that association started all the way back in 1927 at Nicollet Park in Minnesota. This was a minor league baseball stadium. And in 1927, Nicollet Park got large billboards to put advertising slogans on. And the words on the very first of these billboards were penned by a man named Knox Reeves of a Minneapolis advertising agency. He took a look at the Wheaties and thought for a moment and came up with Breakfast of Champions. 1928, we get Rice Krispies, a cereal so crisp it crackles in cream. So we move into the 1930s. This is the decade that brought us the Hoover Dam, Superman, Scotch tape, as well as Gone with the Wind. Now, shredded wheat had been invented in 1890 by a man named Henry Perky, but in 1929, he sold his company to Nabisco. And in 1930, Nabisco debuted Nabisco shredded wheat, and it became a popular standard that you can still get today. Kix debuted in 1930s by General Mills. So the method of making these puffs that they used to make Kix is the same method that General Mills later used to make Trix and Cocoa Puffs. Moving on to the 1940s, this is the decade that brought us Mount Rushmore and Captain America and Tupperware and NASCAR. Cheerios were introduced in 1941 under the name Cheery Oats. This is the first mascot for Cheerios, Cheerio Leary, a little girl who loved her Cheerios. It was advertised as an oatmeal cereal you didn't have to cook. The name was changed in 1945 to Cheerios after Quaker Oats established a trademark on the term oats. Now, 1942 saw the debut of Post Raisin Bran and also Kellogg's Raisin Bran. Now, the first Raisin Bran on the market was Skinner in 1926, and for 17 years, he had the entire market, until both Kellogg and Post decided to make their own version of the product. Skinner responded with ads saying, "Look, no cereal is better than ours. Ours is the original." They had filed for a trademark for the term Raisin Bran, but it was in 1944 that the Supreme Court found you can't trademark Raisin Bran, and the other two were allowed to stay on the market. And even after a cease and desist and a lot of legal wrangling, Skinner lost more and more of their market share. Moving on to 1950, we get to the era of Beatlemania and color TV and Leave It to Beaver.
Remember, kids love Pops, moms love Pops, Pops love Pops. That's Kellogg's Corn Pops. Out of the bowl or out of the box, it's the great new cereal with the sweetening already on it.
Corn Pops were made by Kellogg's in 1950. They have changed their name a few times to have sugar more and less prominently in the name. Frosted Flakes were introduced by Kellogg's in 1952 as Sugar Frosted Flakes, and they kept sugar in the name until 1983. Originally, Tony the Tiger was not the only mascot. He switched off with Katie the Kangaroo, but eventually Tony's popularity won out. Now, pre-sweetened cereals date back to 1939, but in the 50s they really took off, particularly in 1953 with the debut of Super Sugar Smacks. Now, Sugar Smacks boasted a whopping 51% sugar. It had the highest content of sugar of any cereal of them all. In fact, the weight of the box was 56% sugar. General Mills responded by putting out a sugary version of Kix with 46% sugar, and it was called Trix. And Trix had multiple fruity flavors. In 1956, General Mills put out Cocoa Puffs, a cereal with a ton of sugar and a nice cocoa flavor. Moving on to the 1960s, this is the decade that brought us James Bond's first movie, Dr. No. We also got Total Cereal, which had bold comparisons to other cereals, talking about how many bowls you would need to eat. You may remember the very famous Saturday Night Live parody with Phil Hartman. Look. In 1963, Captain Crunch debuted.
The cereal named after me, Captain Crunch. Delightfully sweet, sugar sweet, and fun to munch cause it keeps its crunch.
We also got Life Cereal debuting in 1961. King Vitamin was released by Quaker in 1968 and stayed on shelves till 2019. From 1971 until 2000, George Mann appeared on the box of cereal. He was a former vaudeville performer, and he passed away in 1977, so his face was seen by consumers at breakfast time for decades after he died. Let's move on to the 1970s. This is the decade that first brought us the UPC code, as well as the first ever mobile phone and the floppy disk. This type, the ones that flopped. These ones that didn't flop came later. Now, we've talked about other cereal booms so far, but none were like the 1970s. From 1970 to 1998, the number of cereals that you could find on the shelf completely doubled. It went from about 160 to 340 different brands and types. 1971 saw the debut of the Monster cereals. The big one is Count Chocula and then Frankenberry. Boo Berry's kind of third place. And for a while, you had Yummy Mummy and Fruit Brute. If you ever saw the 1994 film Pulp Fiction, they had a box of Fruit Brute in the film, but Fruit Brute had long been discontinued. Now, since then, they've brought back Yummy Mummy and Fruit Brute on occasion, and they brought forth a first ever female character, Carmela Creeper. It was in the 70s that our mini wheats became Frosted Mini Wheats. In 1977, we got the debut of Cracklin Oat Bran. Now, this is like a healthy cereal, but it's full of brown sugar. It kind of looks a little bit like a piece of dog food, but you would find this, like Dad would be getting this because he needed his fiber. And when you ran out of cereal, you'd try this and then you'd say, oh my God, this is better than all the kids' cereals. So let's move on to the 1980s, the decade that brought us Rambo and Cats on Broadway, as well as the first ever Apple computer. In 1983, Kellogg's brought us Crispex, and they brought this out because they realized that Chex had a huge market share and no competition.
Maybe, then again, no.
Crispix is crispy times 2.
This decade also brought us the Swedish Chef Crunchy Star cereal. Now, I did a whole deep dive into the history of this, but this was a wild product with the imagination of Jim Henson. Unfortunately, the cereal itself was kind of lackluster, a little too healthy, and kids didn't go for it. I mean, nothing was more 80s than the Smurfs, and so the 80s did indeed give us our Smurf cereal. 1983 brought us Mr. T cereal, and you probably remember it from that scene in Pee-wee's Big Adventure.
I pity the poor fool! Don't eat my cereal!
There's a cartoon on the back where thieves steal the truck full of Mr. T cereal, and Mr. T has to go and put him in a headlock. That's real nutrition from Mr. T. Serve it with vitamin D milk, buttered toast, and orange juice for a They always wanted you to add things to your breakfast. They were like, this plus all this other stuff is a complete breakfast. All right, let's bid farewell to the 1980s, move into the 1990s. This is the era of text messaging. This is when we got the Tickle Me Elmo as well as the PlayStation. Pop-Tarts Crunch debuted in the 1990s. The release of Jurassic Park: The Lost World brought us this shiny box for Jurassic Park Crunch, sort of like Lucky Charms, but you got special dinosaur shapes and some dino facts on the back. Here's one that I fondly remember with a crazy looking mascot. This was Big Mix. This cereal had a combination of a lot of different flavors, and they even implied that it was made by sweeping up the factory floor at night.
He's Big Mix. Now Kellogg's introduces Big Mix cereal, as mixed up as Big Mix himself, with oats, rice, wheat, corn, and raisins.
All right, moving on into the 2000s, we get the era of GPS and digital cameras and Lilo and Stitch. We got a lot of limited edition cereals around this time. This was the 2003 Hulk movie. They had their own cereal you could purchase. There also was a Monopoly cereal. Look at this. Look at the little game cards. They're marshmallows. Moving into the 2010s, this is the decade that brought us the Las Vegas Golden Knights and smartwatches and drones. Post introduced a Twinkies cereal in that decade. All right, let's move on to the 2020s. This is the decade that brought us a song by Pow Fu and Biba Doobie called Deathbed. And it also brought us Jojo Siwa cereal. The marshmallows were shaped like little bows. Look at that. Bows were her thing back then. It's fun looking back at this stuff. I want you to check out the video that I did about Crunchy Stars. I love this story. I'm a big Muppets fan. I'm going to put that video right up here for you. Otherwise, YouTube says this is what is best for you. I've got another channel, by the way. You want more videos? I'm reviewing laptops on there. Ones with superheroes on them.